Good afternoon and welcome to the afternoon test missions, 160 metres, and we are ready for another session this afternoon. Don't know how present I'm going to be this week. I'll try and keep these sessions going, but I'm on dinner duty. My better half is involved in a seminar this week during this missions time, so we may have to juggle things a little bit. But first of all, thank you, Mr. Stu, for the signal report from Laura, north or just west of Cooktown. And there is traces of these missions up there, just traces, amidst the static. So it's amazing to think that something gets through at that distance with my meagre 100 watts. But I suppose that's what the grey line beholds, these sort of possibilities. Also, a lovely email from Mr. Kiesling, and thank you for that. And yes, he mentions Stefan Hauser and provided me a link to that remarkable young cellist, and we'll probably feature something of his as well. Yeah, that's another really interesting topic. But I think what we'll do today is we'll continue with some music from Morris Shaw, who's a really good friend of Walter's, or was a good friend of Walter's, and a really interesting musician, great player, Jewish player who had a formative experience, or a very dedicated formative musical life, and then worked for most of his career as an architect, and then came back to music at the end. And there's some remarkable examples of this musician and online, and it's just such a remarkable Australian story, actually, and I'd like to flesh it out and understand it more comprehensively. But what I'll do is we'll just play examples where I can find them, and we'll just get a sort of a sense of Mr. Morris and his exploits, and then we might follow on with a podcast or something to further explore the story in our future missions. But let's have a listen to another dueña. This is music and improvisation in the Romanian, Turkish, Jewish tradition. It sort of heralds a wonderful, very deep cultural referent, I think, this type of playing. It's something that's from the earth, and it's very, very powerful. It communicates incredibly deeply. So this is Morris Shaw, and we'll have a listen now to this performance of a dueña from, I think this is sort of got Romanian antecedents, this music. vk3sl testing. Such a direct communicator, amazing. Music of Moshler, that's Maurice Shaw. Melbourne musician, and he recorded that in Europe, as I understand it. But he had a great power of evoking that deep tradition, European tradition of, the Werner is an improvisation, and it particularly based on that harmonic minor scale fragment, but it goes much deeper than that. It draws something from the speech rhythms and the prayer enunciations, and it's something of lofty disposition, I think. Remarkable. So thank you, Mr. Walter, for that. Okay, we'll continue now, and we'll hear something else that just popped up today. I'm a great fan of Ignaz Friedman's playing. Friedman was another great communicator, fantastic pianist, and he ended up being stranded in Australia, and he was based here from the mid-1930s right through to the late 40s. But he is considered to be perhaps the greatest of Ledecheski's students and a remarkable colourist in that romantic tradition, that great aristocratic tradition of piano playing. Here's a scherzo put up by Mr. Hanna on his Vintage Sounds site. I hadn't heard this recording before, and I listened to it at lunchtime today, and it blew my socks off. Incredible piano playing. Let's have a listen to Scherzo in E minor by Mendelssohn, the music of Ignaz Friedman. vk3sl testing. Tone colour in that recording is absolutely astonishing. And the independence being out of those inner voices, it's so interesting. It's music, it just has its own life. Incredible. Ignaz Friedman on the piano. And to think he spent so much time in Australia, and I think 47 of his concerts were recorded by the ABC in that period, including great performances like the Liszt B minor sonata and numerous concerto recordings. Anyhow, they were all destroyed as a great cultural expunge. Those acetates ended up under the freeway as landfill between Sydney and Newcastle. Go figure, it's crazy stuff. So we've lost most of Friedman's Australian heritage, but those recordings, the recordings that do exist, were made in Europe in the 1920s, including that one, 1926. Okay, let's continue. And now I'd like to play a documentary, and I'm going to sort of be working inside while this is happening. This is a part of a really interesting series made by Glenn Gould, the celebrated Canadian pianist. Glenn Gould did a series of radio docos championing musicians who he admired. And he made these sort of radio pastiches in his inimitable, very intense dialogue and style. And they are really, really interesting to listen to. So here's one on Arnold Schoenberg. So we'll listen to this radio production. It's called Schoenberg, the Man Who Changed Music. I think it's just part one here. If we can find part two, we might play that another time. But have a listen to Glenn Gould, a recording made in the 1960s, 1962 in fact. This is vk3sl testing.
The Man Who Changed Music, a radio portrait of Arnold Schoenberg. As part of CBC Wednesday night, we bring you a special 2-hour documentary on the life and work of one of the great musical figures of our time, prepared and presented by Glenn Gould.
While it is still impossible to form a proper evaluation of Schoenberg's role in musical history, it seems to me that since his death in 1951, his immense contribution to the development of music in our time has slowly but surely been winning wider recognition. Nevertheless, apart from a mere handful of works, his music is relatively inaccessible to the public of today. In tonight's program, therefore, we shall not attempt to arrive at any sort of historical judgment. Rather, our purpose will simply be to explore a few of his compositions, to examine what appear to be certain misconceptions and contradictions surrounding both the man and his music. In short, to try to gain a clearer picture of a truly amazing musical personality.
Arnold Schoenberg, the Man Who Changed Music.
I cannot imagine music in the 20th century without Arnold Schoenberg. He seems to me to be the one indispensable musician of our time. I suppose that one can support the arguments in favor of his having been indispensable rather more easily than one can support the arguments for his having been great. But this does not at all mean that, in my opinion, he was not a great composer. To be honest, I think that in our century, only two men, Schoenberg and Richard Strauss, could be truly deserving of the title giant. It's true, though, that Schoenberg suffered a great deal from the confusion between the theories that he attempted to substantiate and his actual work as a composer. There have been only a few other figures in musical history whose historical position has been so fortunate, or unfortunate, if you will, that it's made difficult for many generations after their own time an honest and objective judgment of their output. I suspect that Schoenberg, like Monteverdi, like Gesualdo, in a way one might say even like Sebastian Bach, will be one of these composers. And I think it's most unlikely that we can expect to clarify all of the confusions surrounding the work of Arnold Schoenberg for many years to come. In fact, it would be rather presumptuous of me to offer anything more on this occasion than an attempt at the validation of my own reactions to his work. Schoenberg was well aware of this confusion which surrounded his work, and when he spoke of it, he was, in his quiet way, rather angry about it, for he regarded himself simply as a composer. He believed that whatever formulations he developed as a composer pertained only to those compositions. Contrary to most opinion today, there existed rather less of the dogmatist in Schoenberg than might be imagined. He was not by any means the all-persuasive propagandist who attempted to coerce associates and admirers into believing wholly in the technical manifestations of his own work, but he did long for the day when they would believe in the work itself.
I wonder sometimes who I am. When the Committee on Lectures and Drama announced my lecture, someone was afraid the readers might not know who I am. So they informed them as follows. A famous theoretician and controversial musical figure known for the influence he is proud to bear on modern music. Up to now, I thought I composed for different reasons.
It may be that Schoenberg was not altogether unjustified in fearing that he would be remembered primarily for the technical solutions which he offered to some of the thorniest musical problems of our time. Indeed, we already seem to be entering upon a period in which, though the name of Arnold Schoenberg is known more and more widely, he is in fact almost as frequent a drawing room reference as Freud or as Kafka, or if you happen to be in a particularly one-up drawing room, Kierkegaard. And yet, many people remark that the works of Schoenberg, except maybe for a few of his docile early compositions, are those which mark particularly significant transitional stages in his development, have so far failed to attract any large share of public attention. What makes it so difficult to know about Schoenberg, to know clearly what the future will hold for him, is the fact that this man's life, which encompasses approximately 50 years of important creative effort, takes place during a moment of transition for music, a moment of transition as profound and as inevitable, perhaps, as that which took place toward the end of the 16th century, in the days when the fantastic complications of modal technique were being overlapped and replaced by the simplifications of the system which we came to call tonality, the system upon which all important Western music of the past 300 years is built. Schoenberg stands at a moment of time in which the musical problems would seem to be not so very different from those which confronted the generation of Gibbons in England, of Sweelinck in the Netherlands, of Monteverdi in Italy. Theirs was the generation which, to varying degrees, sensed the responsibility of clarifying into what could be called a public common language the alternatives and mysteries of modal technique. In point of fact, as we all know, all art is mysterious, and hence the clarification is only a relative process. But it did happen that by the early years of the 17th century, we were presented with the first viable indications that the movement of triadic harmony, upon which all part music of the Renaissance had been based, could function in something approaching a reasonably well-defined relationship, a relationship in which the proprieties of chord movement would be determined by something resembling the force of gravity. There would be in this new music a centrifugal force which would link all harmonic units into a kind of preferential order. This is not to say that gravity, in the sense of a noticeable resolution for a noticeable tension, did not previously exist. Of course it did. But it existed with so many alternatives available, so many enharmonic practices which could abort the flow of triadic resolution, so many intrafraternal rules and regulations, so many codes of the secret lodge of musicians, of which the general public could not know, that music of the High Renaissance was an inordinately complicated and legislated affair. And strangely, it was this new music of the 17th century which seemed, or at any rate which seems by comparison, music of great simplicity and forthrightness, of public as opposed to private character. Well, Schoenberg, in my opinion, stands at a rather analogous moment in history, for despite all of the talk which we hear today of the complications of his technique, the ruthless organization of materials which he's supposed to have advocated, his music stands essentially as an infinitely simpler manifestation of art than does the music of the romantic Wagnerian tradition out of which Schoenberg sprang. This will probably seem a very odd statement, but I think it is true. And admitting that it is true does not necessarily admit that music which is simpler is less inherently interesting. It would be virtually impossible to expect that an idiom or a vocabulary as new as that in which Schoenberg chose to communicate his thoughts to us could be other than a simplification of the immensely complex cross-referenced language which preceded it. The language that Schoenberg inherited, the language of Wagner, of Brahms, of Strauss and Mahler, that's an immensely complicated language. It's a language in which one wonders what greater intensities can possibly be drawn from its vocabulary, in which one gasps as each work seeks to overwhelm one with the effect of an emotional jolt greater than that which preceded it. This is a complicated language. It's a language, moreover, which rides upon the rules of about 300 years of musical technique, a constantly evolving technique, to be sure, but a technique which was fundamentally based upon certain common experiences of controlling a rationale of movement through this particular gravity of chords, a language which, as it grew older, as the 17th century gave way to the 18th, and the 18th to the 19th, underwent many practices which gradually clarified or crystallized its usage, but which primarily became more expressive, more aware of its potential, more complicated in the true sense of the word. And as it grew older and more familiar, its practitioners discovered that all that was left to add to this language was the abortive gesture, the deliberate slackening of discipline, the willingness to do for an expressive reason the wrong thing. And so Schoenberg comes upon the scene of music at a time when such fantastic complication existed, if you accept my definition of complexity, that his primary reaction to the turn-of-the-century world of music was to organize, to rationalize, to intellectualize its relations, to make outward what had to a degree been inward. Now, if Schoenberg did that, and only that, one could perhaps conclude that Schoenberg was an unsubtle man, a man who did not appreciate the complex involutions of musical meaning, and who was determined to make understandable those things which are incapable of being completely understood, to legislate those things which cannot ever be governed. But what must be remembered about Schoenberg and his historical position is that there was an organic disorder which compromised the health of tonality in his day, and it was, of course, due to this fantastic complexity of the vocabulary which he'd inherited, due to the many levels of relationship in musical structure that now existed, that initial simplicity, which was the founding purpose of tonality, became distorted and unbalanced by the presence of what we call a chromatic extension of the tonal vocabulary, that those liberties engendered by tonality in its late stages weakened with every pursuance of an expressive purpose the fundamental tenets of the tonal philosophy. Let's consider for a moment a work like Richard Strauss' Ein Heldenleben. Here is a piece of approximately 50 minutes in length. It's in one movement, which is only to say that it moves continuously without any pause.
vk3sl.
And it encompasses a range of expression of musical allegory, if you will, in this case, which would be virtually unthinkable in any other vocabulary but that of the highly chromatic one which Strauss operates. But for all that it covers so much ground, that it points to so many possibilities, it must be remembered that this scope, this vast canvas, is also an enormous liability. It's very difficult to make with that vocabulary the quick thrust, the indisputable musical statement. There's nothing about Strauss' vocabulary which permits him to do what Beethoven of the last quartets could do in half a phrase. But such was the nature of tonality that each time a more distant relationship was encountered and admitted to the tonal orbit, all of the more fundamental relationships became challenged and had to be artificially strengthened accordingly. The essence of the matter is that the time, the leisure, if you will, had to be available to seek out the variegated relationships near and distant of this fantastically complicated language. So these were the twilight years of tonality, years of a warm and expressive language, but a language which was dying. And as with some who are about to die, it possessed an incredibly beautiful, feverishly transcendent glow. Now, Schoenberg inherited and accepted the challenge of this language, for there was nothing of the anarchist in his makeup. He loved the language which he'd inherited too dearly to destroy it, and yet he realized with a clarity that few can claim to have possessed the basic fact of its evolution. Evolution is the key to a consideration of Arnold Schoenberg, because all of his theories about music and all of his faith about his own participation in history hinge upon the manner in which he interpreted the evolution of music. To Schoenberg, and indeed to many other people as well, all history of art is evolution. This is not to say that with hindsight it evolves, because actually with hindsight almost anything can be made to seem to evolve. It's rather to say that for a man of Schoenberg's temperament, the sense of destiny, of his own participation in history, is bound to an idea that in most cases there is an historically justified line of procedure, and that all other directions at any given time, though fascinating and entertaining and worthwhile and even to a degree influential, are basically beside the point. Schoenberg, it must be remembered, was an Austrian, and of course a more infuriating breed of music-loving people does not exist. To the Austrian, it's the Central European symphonic tradition which has indisputably governed the world of music for 200 years at least, and around which all other developments may be counted as fringe benefits. And so, to an Austrian of the post-Wagnerian years, it's easy to understand why the destiny of music would seem to be right in the hands of his generation, why the solution to the thickening dilemma of chromatic harmony and its motivic implications would be undeniably his to find. It might also be remembered that in this context, even at that other turning point, the year 1600, though German culture was by no means in those days the guiding post that it was in 1900, that even then, among the first to sense the purifying, public demonstrative aspect of the new language of tonality were the Germans. Compare the hearty stability of a Lutheran chorale with the French part song of the same period, and you'll see what I mean. There is something in the German, or to be more inclusive, the Austro-German temperament, which is at once explorative and stable, analytical and instinctive, daring and conservative. Above all, there's the ability to be organized and coherent and as logical as can be, and to find amidst the creation of the most complex rhetoric the vitality, the peasant-like joy of that rhetoric. There is, in this temperament, a desire to effect a conciliation between the needs of the future and reverence for the past. There's a great reluctance to give up that which has been thought worthy of high esteem and which has played a significant part in one's development. And hence the sense of evolution, as Schoenberg meant it, the sense of continuation, of extension, applies to his music and to his life in a rather special way. For Schoenberg was perhaps the most conservative radical who ever lived. At no time in his life did he express either dissatisfaction or disaffection with the tradition which he'd inherited. At no time did he set out to do less than honor to that tradition. As a tonal composer, as a man working primarily, although with rapidly changing emphasis, within the folds of a defined and definable key relation, Schoenberg contributed, in my opinion, some of the most glorious music of the early 20th century. His work within tonality in that period spans approximately 12 years, if one begins to date it from the advent of his first characteristically Wagnerian leader, and it counts up to the last of those works which are unmistakably unified by a responsibility to a single tonal identification. Ironically, it's the first major work of this period, and hence the first major work which Schoenberg ever wrote, the Sextet Verklärte Nacht, which has remained after 60 years the only really popular work of Schoenberg's, the only work, to state it very bluntly, which is any kind of box office attraction on a program today. And what is so ironical about this, and what annoyed Schoenberg so much about it, is the fact that while Verklärte Nacht is indeed a lovely and gracious and beautifully worked out composition, it's the one of his early works which exhibits least the real character of Schoenberg. It accepts, without much question, the basic vocabulary of the late Wagnerian years, and except for an unusually lively and well-integrated inner voice structure, and at times a particularly wide-ranging bass line, there's really nothing about it which more than hints at the way things were actually going for Arnold Schoenberg.
In my Verklärte Nacht, Transfigured Night, the thematic construction is based on Wagnerian model and sequence. Above heroic harmony on the one hand, and on Brahms' technique of, as I call it, of developing variation on the other hand. At this time, I had already become an admirer of Richard Strauss, but not yet of Gustav Mahler, whom I started to understand only much later, at a time when his symphonic style could no more exert its influence on me. But it is still possible that his strongly tonal structure and his more sustained harmony influenced me considerably. There were not many unusual melodic progressions requesting clarification through the harmony.
Another odd thing about Verkleuternach is that it relies very heavily upon what was called in the Victorian era a program, an extra musical reference to a printed text. Appended to it in its first printing was a rather weepily romantic poem by Richard Demel, which tells about the plight of a lady who is, as they say, up the creek. In the course of the poem, which is quite a short one, fortunately, she pours out her heart to the gentleman whom she's betrayed, and at poem's end, or at any rate at the end of the sextet, they wander off into the moonlight with the firm intention of getting churched in D major. Schoenberg was only 25 when he wrote Verkleuternach, and it's really not surprising to find him sharing the enthusiasm of his own generation for the interplay of literary suggestion and musical form. This sort of thing, which was much more common than we now realize, was exactly the premise which allowed the tone poems of Richard Strauss to form a satisfactory conception in Strauss' mind. It has, however, very little to do with the effect of the tone poems upon our ears. But that whole generation of the German post-romantics were concerned about making an interplay between musical and literary architecture. From the opposite side of the fence, we have Thomas Mann attempting to apply the abstractions of a sonata allegro to his lovely early novelette, Tonio Krüger. Really, what it reveals is not so much the promise of the Wagnerian art amalgam theory, but rather the genuine desperation that lay at the heart of so much of the musical problem of that day. These textual references, no matter how little we care about them, provided for the composer a kind of signpost that could be followed conceptually, something to grab hold of in this idiom which allowed too much luxury, which partook of too much abundance. In this period, which includes Verkleuternach, the symphonic poem Pelléas and Mélisande, the first two string quartets, and the E major chamber symphony, Schoenberg is, in my opinion, a complete master of the late Romantic language, a language which he uses here in a most personal and intellectualized way. But not everyone agrees. The critic Winthrop Sargent, for instance, believes that even the early Schoenberg was a minor figure in a post-Wagnerian world.
Well, whether a man is major or minor, I mean, one has, how major and how minor. I don't think that the early Schoenberg, and by this I really mean the Schoenberg of Gurrelieder and Verkleuternach, in other words, the completely tonal and rather Wagnerian works, was a not too original and rather weak composer. His work in the first place was quite derivative from Wagner. It isn't so much a matter of the technique, it's a matter of
vk3sl.
what the music conveys. And Verkleuternach, for example, to me, is a very pleasant composition to listen to, but I wouldn't put it on a par with a symphony of Gustav Mahler's, for example. Nor would I put Gurrelieder in that position. I've listened to it several times. At first I was very impressed by it, and later on I began to think, well, it's a little bit weak and unoriginal.
In comparison with Verkleuternach, the Kammer Symphony, Opus 9, is a work of incredible power and drive, a work which is controlled by a wonderfully firm hand. As Verkleuternach is rhapsodic and whimsical, languid and sequential, so the Kammer Symphony is tight and driven, functional and classical. Its outline is that of the classical symphony of 4 movements, but truncated into one long movement, the final section being, in effect, a summing up of all the thematic material of the work, and a partial recapitulation of the opening section as well. The tonality is nominally that of E major, but the chromatic manipulation is really quite different than that of Verkleuternach, because here Schoenberg is examining the consequences of relating to a primary triadic formation dissonantly conceived chordal progressions. The point is, however, that he still relates them, that when we hear this 4th chord progression, for instance, We hear it not only as a strangely dissonant unit, but as a harmonic substance which bears a fundamental genetical relationship to its subsequent, if complicated, resolution into the tonic. But this was an enormous step forward for Schoenberg, because previously his sense of the emancipation of dissonance was largely concerned with the concept of ambiguity, of indecision, of stating so many chromatic factors that the primary tonality became distended almost beyond recognition. Here, however, we're really more aware at times of E major than we were of D minor in Verklärte Nacht, but nevertheless we've come with the Kammer Symphony very much closer to an autonomy of dissonance.
The climax of my first period is definitely reached in Kammer Symphony Opus 9. I was at this time able to write a theme which I thought not to be related to the main theme, but nevertheless it seemed so logically to me that I didn't cross it out. And as I said, years later I found the solution in that I saw the relation. And I say, if there is a composer capable of inventing themes on the basis of such a remote relationship, I am not one of them.
This period ends with the composition of the second string quartet, Opus 10, which dates from the year 1908, and which introduces in its last movement a texture of such romantic expansion, such wildly leaping ninths and sevenths, that it can no longer be said to partake seriously of any responsibility to a coordinated tonal center. As a matter of fact, there's a bit of a shock inherent in this work, and really not one about which I'm entirely convinced organically. There seems to me to be a little something of the gimmick about the introduction of his first tonal work within a composition which in its other three movements is related entirely to a tonality of F sharp. There is, however, significantly enough attached to this last movement a vocal part for soprano with the rather illuminating text from Stefan Georg. I feel the breath of other planets blowing. more specifically with the last movement of that quartet. Schoenberg moved into the world of atonality, and with the exception of a few works written during his American residence in the 1930s and 40s, he never again composed within a conventional tonal discipline. There must have been a strange stirring abroad in the world of 1908, 1909, because certainly Schoenberg, though he was an intrepid explorer of musical possibility, was by no means the only composer who sensed this disintegration of the tonal vocabulary. Or if he was the only composer who did sense it, then his influence and sense of conviction must have been so overwhelming upon such men as Anton Webern and Alban Berg that they too were within a year pursuing their musical destinies in the same direction as Schoenberg's recourse to pure dissonance. But there was even more to it than that. This was the same time, in fact it was almost the same year, in which Wassily Kandinsky painted the first of his improvisations series, which were to make as influential a break with representational art as did Schoenberg's atonality with tonal music. It is indeed uncanny the way in which the visual arts paralleled the development of atonal music at this time, and particularly the way in which they joined with atonal music in moving toward a purpose which could be described superficially as total abstraction in the years immediately preceding the First World War. It's often been pointed out by critics of this new music that the error of such a profound change is that it does not evolve as language does, slowly, functionally, within the common reference of the public. It's perfectly true that various devices of contemporary poetry approximate to some degree the calibration of the world of serial technique, but by and large, and not even excepting the last works of James Joyce, there's been no fundamental change in the nature of literary materials. There's been no sense of divorce between the writer and the reading public, as there would seem to have been between the musician and his audience. And herein, it seems to me, lies one of the major clues to the nature of this transition which occurred. Namely, that insofar as the most serious constructive efforts, such as those of a Schoenberg or of a Kandinsky, are concerned, there's no fundamental change in the attempt at communication that's been evolved. It's simply that music, in all forms, in all periods, is an art of total abstraction. It is not an art which is fundamentally allegorical, except perhaps in the highest metaphysical sense, and that it does not, and has not, with very few exceptions, pretended to be other than a means of expressing the mysteries of communication in a form which is equally mysterious. If my explanation of the relativity of atonality is to be accepted, I suppose that it must necessarily exclude many of the comments which have been made about the derivation of atonality, particularly those which are concerned with the significance of its having first appeared in the turbulent years immediately preceding the First World War. I don't believe that the undeniable state of chaos in the world of those days had very much to do with the artistic function of atonality, or of abstraction in art for that matter, if only for the reason that not all human beings are equally moved, or at any rate moved in the same direction, by the events and tensions of their own time. If we feel, for instance, that the inevitable expression of the turbulence and chaos of World War I was depicted in a disintegration of tonality, then how can we possibly explain that another master like Richard Strauss saw nothing inconsistent in retaining the practices and boundaries of tonality, and not only that, but indeed during those very years of war, in writing the Opera Die Frau ohne Schatten, a work which not only accepts a frame of harmonic reference more restricted than that of his previous Electra or Salome, but deals in its plot with a sort of unworldly allegory, such as would make the complexities of Parsifal seem child's play. Nor should we over-dramatize, I think, the shattering blow which came at that time to the comfortable world of the Edwardians. The world knew what suffering could mean long before the days of Kaiser Wilhelm. And again, the reaction to pain, to suffering, is such a personal thing. It doesn't necessarily entail the dissipation of order. It can be depicted by an attempt to invoke an artistic order, to compensate for distress. Schoenberg, for instance, didn't suffer more as a man than did Mahler, and yet Mahler, in his moments of most excruciating sorrow, is driven to the kind of tonal simplicity which, in his view, meant a transcendence of the world's problems. So it seems to me to be a great mistake to read into the fantastic transition of music in our time a total social significance. Undeniably, there do exist correlations between the developments of a social stratum and the art which grows up around it, just as the public manner of early Baroque music rests to some degree upon the development in Europe of a merchant class in the late 16th century. But it's terribly dangerous, I think, to advance a complicated social argument for a change which is fundamentally a procedural one within the operative scope of artistic discipline. In the music that Schoenberg wrote between the second string quartet of 1908 and the beginning of the First World War, there are still, as one might expect, a good many vestiges of key relation. But these vestiges now have the nostalgia that we associate with the reminiscence of a bygone and much-loved period.
The first step occurred in the songs Opus 14, and thereafter in the 15 songs of the Hanging Garden and the 3 piano pieces Opus 11. Most critics of this new style failed to investigate up to which degree the ancient eternal laws of musical aesthetic were observed, spurned, or merely adjusted to changed circumstances. Such superficiality brought about these accusations of anarchy and revolution, while it was distinctly evolution, no more exorbitant than that which always has occurred in the history of music.
Evolution. Listen, for instance, to this passage from the second of the piano pieces, Opus 11, in which, if I'm not mistaken, you'll detect a very distant reminiscence of the key of D minor. In that example, the nature of the D minor reminiscence is largely confined to the alternation of the bass notes D and F, and since it's by no means a particularly successful composition, one could conclude from it that there was, in the device of constant reiteration, a measure of desperation, a determination to hold as long as possible to some central source of reference. Here, on the other hand, is another brief excerpt which coincidentally also suggests D minor. It is from the Opus 15, Songs of the Hanging Gardens, but notice how much more subtle and varied the harmonic implications of this song. In other words, in this music there still exists to a degree an order of preference, a process of selection, determined by the faint reminiscence of tonal chromatic procedures. There does not, in the sense that we now use the word, exist atonality. But listen to this brief example from Schoenberg's Opus 19, and in it, unless you read in references which convey, as they say, different things to different people, you'll not likely detect any real tonal center. The only difference in that example, which we just played from Schoenberg's 6 piano pieces, Opus 19, is that that brief instant of music, all 21 seconds of it, constitutes an entire bagatelle. Indeed, all 6 of the Opus 19 require not more than 5 minutes for performance. Can you imagine the sense of horrifying change which must have occurred in the world of Arnold Schoenberg? A change that would make the man who wrote Gererlieder and Pelléas and Mélisande 10 years earlier confine himself now to the activity of writing tiny pieces for the piano. Not that there's anything wrong with writing tiny pieces for the piano, but these small pieces tell us more about the fundamental desperation of Schoenberg's position in 1911 or 1912 than any words could do. Here he was committing himself to a language which he did not know, a language which he had no means to govern except that of his innate musicality. What a temptation it must have been to return to the solid ground that supported him only a few years before. Of course, it would be a loss of face. His pupils who had committed themselves to this language as well might look elsewhere for inspiration, but it would be safer. He could once again compete on more or less equal terms with men like Max Reger or Richard Strauss. But of course, this did not, I suppose, could not happen. For Schoenberg was a man possessed by the determination to stand or fall by the path which he'd set for himself. And even if following that path meant confining the energies of his musical craft to minutiae for the piano, this too could be borne. Someone once rather kindly remarked these small pieces that they managed to compress a novel into a sigh. problem which faced Schoenberg was to decide in what way this void of dissonance which he'd created for himself could be organized, in what way it could be manipulated in a more meaningful manner. There were so many ways in which things could go in this strange new world of dissonance. Was one way necessarily more meaningful than the next? Schoenberg logically deduced that if it was the vast expanse of chromatic harmony which had launched him into the atonal orbit, and if in turn it was the elongated, writhing, melodic manner of the post-Wagnerians which had been the cause of having arrived at this extensive chromatic vocabulary, then perhaps it was this very melodic manner, this superchromatic phrase structure, which provided the clue to organizing the universe of atonality. Would it not be possible, he thought, to build motives of such length and endurance that they would provide within themselves the nucleus of many other motives which would relate to them, and perhaps give a clue as well to the sense of proportionate relation between the various structural components? But nothing in Schoenberg's background equipped him for this challenge, because although he had a great deal of experience in creating those long-limbed melodic figures which his generation found so alluring, he'd always conceived of them as existing entirely within a harmonic reference which, though it might be greatly extended and modulative because of them, was nonetheless triadic in concept. And as we've seen, the first step in determining a sense of harmonic values independent of tonality came with works like the Kammer Symphony, which exhibited in that celebrated instance of the fourth chord, which we heard a few minutes ago, an autonomy of dissonance, which was, if only for a moment, two-dimensional. Removed from its harmonic obligation to resolve, a dissonant unit like a fourth chord could provide in more or less equal measure both a melodic and a harmonic, a horizontal and a vertical unity. So Schoenberg, at the time when he'd broken away from tonal composition, was faced with trying to construct a whole system of harmony independent of a tonal center, in which a relativity of chords would exist, a relativity based on the greater or lesser degree of dissonance which they contained, and, most important, on the degree to which, as in that fourth chord example, he could reasonably expect to persuade the interval units of his themes, his motives, to separate intelligibly in a vertical manner as well. The first part of this problem was a lot simpler to solve than the second part. It was much easier to create a certain relativity of chord tension than to do this while maintaining the interval link between horizontal units and their harmonic emanations. It should be remembered, however, that it is rather more difficult, particularly with the full-blooded texture of Schoenberg's instrumental and orchestral thinking of that day, to avoid the implication of a triadic source. We humans, as Mr. Freud pointed out to us, are notorious for our ability to associate, even when the association is nothing more than the webs that dreams are made of. And it's difficult to listen to the Schoenberg of that period without writing in triadic connotations, which he really didn't intend to imply at all. Within the aesthetic which Schoenberg employed, the sentiment which governed the spirit of his work more genuinely than any other was the insistence upon regarding a work of art as a totally comprehensible, unified object. No concept has caused greater confusion or opened Schoenberg's arguments to wider challenge, because the question which governs all art is to what degree is it accidental, to what degree is it entirely worked out before the fact. Schoenberg was well aware that both these questions were essentially mysteries which must go lacking an answer, and which can at best be expected to hold a relative answer for any one creative person.
vk3sl.
But his own persuasion lay in acknowledging a conception before the fact, in which from a certain embryonic cell which represented itself as the governing and propelling factor in the creative judgment, the work of art would spring. It was most significant that the more Schoenberg grasped this concept, the less he wrote. There was something almost nullifying about its magnitude. In fact, for almost 10 years, Schoenberg, except for dallying with his never-to-be-finished oratorio, Jacob's Ladder, wrote almost nothing at all. Perhaps he'd come too far. Perhaps no man could encompass within a lifetime such an enormous transition. These were the silent years for Arnold Schoenberg. And for a creative man, the silent years are usually years of despair. Eventually, after this long period of thought and of silence, Schoenberg formulated the theory of composition which has since made his name the most frequent target of the critics of contemporary music. It brought him under a degree of fire which made the criticism of his early atonal work seem like the harmless spray of a child's water pistol. For now Schoenberg was not simply asserting his own right to wander in the strange world of atonality. He was suggesting that there was an application of logic of which this world deserved to know, a logic which would justify the use of total dissonance, and suggesting, moreover, that this organization of atonality, which he now conceived and advocated, could apply not only to his own music, but to all other music composed within that vocabulary. This governing organization was what became known as the 12-tone technique.
In 1915, I had sketched a symphony, the scherzo of which accidentally consisted of 12 tones. Only 2 years later, a further step in this direction occurred. I had planned to build all the main themes of my unfinished oratorio, the Jakobsleiter, out of 6 tones. I called this working with the tones. Not yet 12 tones. I had at this time not discovered all the technical tools which furnish such abundance of variety as is necessary for expansive forms.
At first, this system seemed not only perverse and arbitrary, it seemed almost laughably naive, for its underlying premise was that this embryonic cell, the tone row, would not itself necessarily be part of the work. Though it might be applied literally as a melodic unit on occasion, it would essentially stand aloof from the work and simply be the source of reference to which the composer's invention would be applied. But it would not be part of the work the way the keel of a ship is part of that ship. It would lie like some mysterious unborn specimen upon the composer's writing table, and from it, by contemplating and pondering it, by inventing certain numbers of permutational variations upon it, the work as a series of variative ideas would spring forth. The 12 tones of the tone row, or the tone series, or the Grundgestalt, as Schoenberg called it, and which were, of course, the 12 tones of the chromatic scale, were to appear in a constant sequence which could be varied in posture but not in substance by transposing the set and having it begin on some of the other notes of the chromatic scale. But once the initial tone had made its appearance, it could not depart the scene without having brought with it all 11 of its relatives, nor could it, in the particularly authoritarian manner with which Schoenberg first conceived it, reassert within the context of one transposition an earlier member of the set, for fear that this would provide a kind of quasi-tonal reminiscence. Since the underlying premise of this kind of composition depends on employing a principle of constant variation, any of the primary forms indigenous to the total set were equally welcome. The inversion, that's the turning upside down, the retrogression, that's the proceeding from back to front, and the retrogressive inversion, or if you prefer, the inverted retrogression, which is, of course, oh, why don't I just leave that to your imagination? There are a few other principles of this kind, most of them equally arbitrary, and all of them designed to limit the chance aspect of composition. And Schoenberg, with the formulation of this strange new code, became, as you can imagine, the most hated, feared, laughed at, and very occasionally respected composer of his generation. But the odd thing about it was that with this oversimplified, exaggerated system, Schoenberg began to compose again. And not only did he begin to compose, he embarked upon a period of about 5 years, which contained some of the most beautiful, colorful, imaginative, fresh, inspired music which he ever wrote. Out of this concoction of childish mathematics and debatable historical perception came an intensity, a joie de vivre, which knows no parallel in Schoenberg's life. How could this be, then? Of what strange alchemy was this man compounded that the sources of his inspiration flowed most freely when stemmed and checked by legislation of the most stifling kind? And odder still, what was the peculiar attraction of this system which took hold upon the imagination of men like Alban Berg and Anton Webern and made them mold it into a destiny so very different from that of Schoenberg? I suppose part of the answer lies in the fact that Schoenberg was always intrigued by numbers and afraid of numbers and attempting to read his destiny in numbers. And after all, what greater romance of numbers can there be than to govern one's creative life by them? And I suppose part of it was due to the fact that after 15 years awash in a sea of dissonance, Schoenberg felt himself to be on firm ground once again. Thirdly, part of it is certainly that all music must have a system, and that particularly in those moments of rebirth, such as Schoenberg had led us into, it's much more necessary to adhere to the system, to accept totally its consequences, than at a later, more mature stage of its existence. Since the system itself was so new, the formal aspect of Schoenberg's compositions at this time acquired, strangely for him in view of his basic 19th century mentality, an almost entirely 18th century foundation. The movements, still rather short ones, of these first 12-tone works take the form of gavottes, mousettes, gigues, of simple canons and mock violent preludes, of gentle intermezzi and jocular marches. That was the first movement of Schoenberg's Serenade, Opus 24, written in 1924, and a work which is only, as the initiate would have it, partly 12-tone. It is, however, one of the best examples of what this new discipline meant for Schoenberg. Like most of the other compositions of that period, which includes the septet, the piano suite, the woodwind quintet and the third string quartet.
This is a test
Stimulated by an
transmission from
extremely lyric touch, delicious and,
vk3sl.
for Schoenberg, rather surprising interest in delicate timbre. That was a mandolin and guitar which you heard in that piece, in addition to clarinets and string trio. And, in general, by a particularly joyous and airy control of sonority. The liaison between the arbitration of 12-tone theories and the compacted forms of the 18th century was a strange one, but an admirable one, for within the binary folds of these little dance movements lie some of the subtlest organizational premises of early tonality. And Schoenberg, without ever once suggesting tonality, suggests that unique sense of balance, of cadential propriety, and of modulated reintroduction of material, which gave the Baroque dance movements their unique poise. I think eventually this period of the early 12-tone works will be regarded, perhaps in addition to the tonal decade of 1900, as the most entirely happy and productive years of Schoenberg's life. It's true that they were years of conciliation, and that those approaches which he made toward a liaison of serial technique in the musical forms of the 18th century could not at best provide more than a passing haven. But imagine how thrilling it must have been to discover that there was a way to adapt the motivic scope of atonality and the licentious freedom of its harmonic possibilities within a familiar formal enterprise. It may also be that there was such a mating of conservative and radical in Schoenberg's disposition, that these two periods in his life were especially happy precisely because of that measure of conciliation, of amalgamation between those things which he dared to try and the reminiscence of those things which he dearly loved.
vk3sl, you've been listening to Glenn Gould, his lecture or his radio production on Schoenberg. It's entitled The Man Who Changed Music. We'll go on now and have a listen to part 2 of this presentation, and I'm finding it intensely interesting. I'm out there cooking dinner, stirring the pasta, stoking the fire, and listening to this. So it goes for another hour. So there's even more where that came from. So stand by if you're inclined. I think this is a very interesting lecture, and it says a lot about directions in music in the 20th century. Fascinating stuff. vk3sl testing.
America, no immigrant has ever arrived with a stranger reputation. There were probably only a handful of people in the United States in that day who realized the importance of the little man who arrived on a New York dock one morning in October of that year. To the majority of musicians at the time, and certainly to almost all of the musical audience, Schoenberg represented the most demoniacal tableau of genius turned into insanity that the world of music had ever known. Indeed, I wonder even if there were many people who thought in those days of his earliest works as works of genius, for they too were at the time suffering the fate of almost total obscurity.
A famous cellist told me that he was in the Berlin Philharmonic when the premiere of Schoenberg's Theme and Variations was performed. Furtwängler, I think, was the conductor, and after the first 5 or 6 measures, the whole orchestra was lost, and they somehow just went on. And my cellist friend said that he turned to his partner and said, "Play something nice," and so they practiced the Dvorak concerto and ran over a few Schubert trios, cello parts, or whatever came to mind. At the finish of the piece, there was a great deal of hissing and booing, and I think he told me the only applause came from one box which seated Arthur Schnabel, who, as you know, was an enthusiast of Schoenberg's music, and I think Schoenberg's brother-in-law, a small group of friends.
The group of friends, according to the composer's widow, Frau Gertrude Schoenberg, was indeed very small.
We never had this kind of entourage with people of minds and of influence have usually. He was always alone. We were also alone in I wouldn't say Vienna at all, because Vienna is self-understanding, but even in Berlin we had perhaps 4 or 5 people coming, and that's all. We didn't have any friends here. When we came, the only person we knew in Hollywood was Mr. Riesenfeld, who was he was in Viennese, who came here and had all the movie theater, with those big orchestras they had. He was in New York, and he lost his whole money, and he came to Hollywood to write movies. And after that, he heard about Schönberg being stranded in Pasadena and not getting a house there because we had a child, and this was murder in Pasadena. So he came right away and took us to Hollywood. But we had nobody here, and he really came especially for his health. Only much later he got an offer to teach in SC first and then in UCLA. It is one of those strange coincidences in his life that the people who were renowned at that time never wanted to meet him. They had an awe. They were afraid of meeting him. But Schönberg loved to talk with people of some kind of intelligence, and this he missed always, I must say.
One man who did attempt to meet Schönberg was the American composer Evan Copeland.
We had, Schönberg and I, a brief incident which seems rather amusing in retrospect, which I didn't enjoy very much at the time it was happening, because it put me in the position of being anti-Schönbergian in his mind, which I certainly wasn't. As a matter of fact, I think I was probably one of the first people in the United States to give public lectures on Schönberg in the mid-20s, public lectures, that is, and I always did my best to present his work as fairly as I could. In fact, I went so far as to play one of the Opus 11 piano pieces. He somehow had the impression during the last years of his life that people were trying to prevent his music from being played. It must have been a very difficult experience to be a man of Schönberg's gift and his actual production, and to watch conductors year after year programming pieces by men he knew did not have the value of himself. And so in the end it really got under his skin, and he felt that men like Toscanini and Kusevitsky were against him. And it's, for some reason or other, I must have somehow gotten into that crowd of people. At any rate, he thought I was against him, and he wrote a letter that was published in the column that Virgil Thompson wrote each Sunday in the New York Herald Tribune, in which he combined my name with others who were attempting to, as he put it, stop his career or get in the way of his career. So I hastened to write a letter back to the Tribune pointing out that I wasn't in any sense against his career, that I was an admirer of what he had done and so forth. And in the end, we did have a personal exchange of letters in which he indicated that someone had been telling him things about me that he was glad to hear were not so. So it had a happy end, but in my mind, it gave me the sense that he must have had a feeling of being persecuted, actually, whether he was in fact persecuted or not. He had that feeling.
He was very straightforward. He was a kind of man who never showed off at all. And he could just have been a simple merchant too when you talked with him of ordinary things. So publicity was not done for him at all, and people who, like in Vienna, they said, it's a crazy man, let's not associate with him, And we never know, should we say yes to what he's thinking, or shouldn't we rather omit it? We always have time to come in. Now, also those people all were of a quite different social standings. They all had money, they all had their securities. They were hesitant, And when he met somebody, he was always the one who gave much more and was happy, and then he got a knock on his head.
He was a very curious mentality, it seems to me. Not at all my kind of person. If I were thinking of him purely as a human being, not a man I would naturally want to spend an evening with. I like someone that more humanist, let's say. He was probably very humanist in his spirit, I'm sure he was. But there was a kind of fanatic thing at the very bottom of his core, which you could not argue with. I remember once meeting him, and either he asked me what I was writing, or in some way it turned out that I had been just writing a ballet. Well, he took a very dim view of ballets. Ballets were not things that interested him, and didn't seem a serious art form, and he made no bones about telling me that. I knew that I'd hear something like that. I didn't know quite what, but at any rate, it seems to me to typify the man as a man. I don't think of him as a solid citizen who can be followed in everything that he says and does. It isn't necessary that a great man like Schoenberg should be a solid citizen. It's just that if you're going to spend an evening with a man, you sort of don't get anywhere if you can't get the sense you're going to in some way change his thinking. Naturally, you can sit at his feet like a disciple and listen. That would be extremely instructive. But it's not quite the same thing as exchanging ideas with a reasonable human being.
One American who did spend and enjoy an evening with Schoenberg was the San Francisco psychiatrist, Dr. Peter Ostwald. In 1948, Dr. Ostwald was a student of Schoenberg's at the Music Academy of the West in Santa Barbara, California.
The only time I saw him at home, so to speak, without a formal class setting, was one evening when he invited those of us who were interested in chamber music over to his house to listen to records of his quartets. At that time, the quartets had not been issued in this country, or at least not in any modern recording, so this was a rare opportunity to become acquainted with his music. And I think he was quite restrained. He certainly didn't put on any airs of being a prophet or a professor or anything like that. He was quite humble and Viennese in a way that, wanting to make everyone comfortable and be sure that they enjoyed the evening. He didn't strike me as a stern person. He had, at that time, 2 sons, one about 5 and the other about 7, and a daughter who was about 13. And considering what an old man he was, really old enough to be their grandfather or great-grandfather, he seemed very kind and thoughtful. He was too ill, I think, at that time to play with them very much, but he seemed very considerate. One got more the impression, though, that all efforts were made to be kind to him. Both the children and his wife seemed terribly concerned always about him. He was very fragile. He was constantly having asthmatic attacks and would have to pull out a kind of adrenaline spray and medicate himself. So it was difficult, perhaps, for him to be as supportive and understanding towards others as it would have been the other way around. One may have thought that he was stern from his demeanor and behavior, rather. Well, he looked stern in a sense. He had, at that time anyway, he was thin and quite wrinkled, and even though he had one of those very luscious Hollywood tans, one could see there really the fading aspects of a man, and this may have given him a kind of stern appearance, but he didn't speak in a stern way. If you've heard recordings of his voice, he had a rather high-pitched voice, halting and not at all stern.
Another Californian, an expatriate German, who was not at all sure about his affection for Schoenberg at this period, was the novelist Thomas Mann. Mann had been an occasional visitor at the Schoenberg home during the war years, and may have on some of those occasions attempted to pump Schoenberg for information about composition procedures which were of interest to him at the time. For Mann was then engaged in writing the work which he believed to be his summation of the rise and fall of German culture, the novel Dr. Faustus. Dr. Faustus operates on several levels of symbolism, but its central character is a composer whose name in the novel is Adrian Leverkühn. Leverkühn renews the Faust legend by having a pact with hell which permits him to sell his soul for so many years of inspired creativity. This did, indeed, for all its potential, turn out to be one of the worst novels that Thomas Mann ever wrote. But what seems to have bothered Schoenberg about it specifically was that the technical practices which are described in some detail and attributed to Adrian Leverkühn are those which bear a rather marked similarity to 12-tone composition. In any event, there seems to have existed an exchange of letters in which Schoenberg asked to be given reasonable credit for the introduction of this system, to which Thomas Mann responded by a rather tersely worded second printing announcement, something to the effect that the 12-tone system described in chapter something or other is actually the invention of Arnold Schoenberg, a contemporary composer and theoretician. To this, Schoenberg responded by renouncing their friendship.
When Thomas Mann came here, he invited him, and he was very happy to talk to an intelligent and great man. And we got quite friendly, but the level the talk went was not really the level it should go. And I can prove that by telling you that after he was at our place and Schoenberg talked with him about music and everything, the only thing he wrote in his little diary was that he got a very good coffee from Mrs. Schoenberg. So this is my point, you know. People didn't approach him like they should do.
One man who had some difficulties approaching Schoenberg in these years was the recording executive, Goddard Lieberson, who attempted to get Schoenberg to make a recording of Pierrot Lunaire in 1939 or 40, which the composer was to conduct, and he found that there were certain difficulties in dealing with Schoenberg on matters of business.
You know, we recorded Pierrot Lunaire, and this was the first recording, I believe, of that work. It was in the old days, it was on 78 RPM, it was with Erika Stiedry Wagner, or Erika Wagner Stiedry. And doing it was quite an undertaking. It was an undertaking for a number of reasons. It was a daring thing to do, and much less modern music was done in that time. I can't quite put you into the to use a fashionable word, the posture of that time, but it was modern music was a much rarer occasion on records than it is today, or since the advent of the LP. And most such things were done by organizations, modern music organizations, or Schubert societies, or Hugo Wolf societies, or whatever societies existed. There was none for Schoenberg, needless to say. So, naturally, this was greeted with some enthusiasm at the beginning. The enthusiasm soon soured in the details of trying to get it done. This was because Schoenberg inherently, and perhaps justifiably, after years of really terrible neglect, and a neglect that we can't even conceive of now because he was considered quite insane. Schoenberg had, from this background, developed a mild, might call it, to keep it from being clinical, a literary paranoid feeling about the persecution of himself and of his music. So naturally, along the way, in making the arrangements, any change that had to be made because of financial consideration was considered not a necessity, but rather a direct challenge to his authority, to his genius, to his artistry. And I would say some of our difficulties came from that, to the extent that finally I wrote to him and I said, why do you look upon me as a one-man committee to undermine Schoenberg when not I, but Columbia Records is at the moment, trying to make the only recording of an important work of yours, which you are conducting. Then he wrote me a rather more conciliatory letter after that. And it was very friendly. I don't wish to exaggerate it, but I do wish to point out his, what you might call his psychological sensitivity.
Peter Ostwald, as a young man, seems to have caught a rather different impression of Schoenberg's sense of humility, if such it was. He seems to feel that although Schoenberg had no false modesty concerning his own ability, neither was he unduly aggressive in propagandizing his reputation.
I can only clearly recall at one time that he spent an a lecture on his own music, and I believe he used exactly the same approach to his own music that he did to the works of Beethoven that he analyzed, and one Brahms symphony I think he analyzed. There didn't seem to be much difference at all. It was my impression that he considered himself in many ways an old master, capable of the same kind of thoroughgoing musical analysis that he applied to the other old master. I really am not sure now how much he said about it, but in general I would think that he would occasionally acknowledge that a particular moment in the piece was quite moving or beautifully worked out, successful. I don't think he commented in a negative way about himself.
The works of Schoenberg's later years can be said on the whole to consolidate his thinking about the use of serial technique. Considering that Anton Webern was already writing in that curiously pointillistic manner of his during Schoenberg's lifetime, it's perhaps significant that Schoenberg, as he grew older, tended to grow once again larger in scope, broader in design than he had been in the early 12-tone compositions like the Serenade. In fact, it was in this later period that he once again toyed with the idea of writing within a key signature. There are only a few works of this kind, to be sure, of which the most interesting are Kol Nidre for chorus, narrator, and orchestra, the Ode to Napoleon for Sprechstimme, string quartet, and piano, and the variations on a recitative for organ. The prevalence of tonality in these works is rather variable, the variations on the recitative being solidly D minor, which seems to have been a rather favorite key for Schoenberg, while the Ode to Napoleon reflects a tonal center at only crucial moments. Kol Nidre, which was written in 1938, is a strangely troubling work. The sense of tonality here is altogether grayer, much less colorful than the flamboyant chromaticism of Schoenberg's youth. In fact, this is not, in the conventional sense of the word, chromaticism at all. The harmonic language has a slight resemblance to, let's say, Max Reger in a droll mood, but we soon realize that something rather odd is going on here. The fact is that the prevailing triadic course of this music is arranged not according to the respect of tonal voice leading, but is derived out of a 12-tone principle furnished by using a row which favors division into triadic groups. Thus, the harmonization at this moment, the relation between the chords of B major and G flat major and E flat major, forms part of an harmonic cycle of major and minor chords which, with various permutations, relates to the entire 12-tone spectrum. No one can really say why Schoenberg began exploring an arbitrary tonal direction so late in his life. It may have been simply nostalgia for the world he'd left behind 30 years before. I think it most unlikely that it could have been in deference to the religious sentiment of Kol Nidre, since his later cantata, Survivor of Warsaw, though a much weaker work, is in some respects the most futuristic piece of his last period, and of course deals with the tragedy of war in a most personal way. Nor was it in any sense, I'm sure, a concession to the commercial spirit of America, his new home. Whatever may have been the reason, Schoenberg's quasi-tonal works of this period provide one of the most valuable lessons that we learn from him in the use of serialism, because with these works, Schoenberg refutes a good deal of the idealism of his early 12-tone method, and he also provides the first major instance of the serially derived harmonic focus. That's to say that with these works, we discover that the organic stimulus of serial organization does not necessarily have to operate in a world devoid of preference. And Schoenberg, with these works, foreshadows a development which is now taking place of permutational concessions which are deliberately designed in certain instances to provide a focus upon a particular harmonic unit which will recur more emphatically than statistical equality would allow. In short, these works, if not altogether satisfactory in themselves, represent one of the most important aspects of Schoenberg's later 12-tone thinking. These quasi-tonal works, though, were only a very small part of Schoenberg's output in his later years. Among the major works of the American residents were the violin and piano concertos, opus 36 and 42 respectively, and the string trio, opus 45, all written in a more conventional 12-tone discipline. Each of these works, despite the mastery of the craft which is now exhibited, and I mean mastery here not in the sense of a clever use of an arbitrarily designed mechanical invention, but rather as the acknowledgement of the relative success of a work of art independent of the agreements accorded its technical devices. Each of these works exhibits, it seems to me, a rather more aloof and dispirited profile than that which we'd come to know from the Schoenberg of the 1920s and early 30s. There's a certain coldness and architectural precision which seems on occasion to have taken precedence over a more fluid invention. There is also, once again, that curious collaboration which Schoenberg managed to effect between the instrumental aims of an earlier period, in this case the 19th century, and its architectural devices, and the exigencies of his own serial situations. In the later 12-tone work, such as the piano concerto, Schoenberg becomes a good deal more sophisticated in handling the operations of a tone row, though one could hardly say he's managed to make the manipulation of its interval structure penetrate every dimension of a composition. He did not, for instance, attempt to apply serial principles to matters of rhythm, which, since his death, has become one of the more important premises of serial construction. His rhythmic devices, as a matter of fact, tend to be rather square. Schoenberg rarely attempts to transcend the impositions of the bar line, as did Webern in his later work. There is, however, in Schoenberg a remarkably varied sense of rhythmic structure, and almost always an ability to interpret the mood of a work through a strongly angular sense of rhythmic projection. What is important about the piano concerto and the works of his later years is that he's managed to a considerable extent to effect that integration of harmonic and melodic materials towards which he directed so much effort in the transitional years of his life, the years following the dissolution of tonality. He achieves this integration through many different devices, of which perhaps the simplest is to create the accompaniment to a theme out of the notes adjacent to it in the tone series. Such an example is the lovely opening theme from the piano concerto. Perhaps the least subtle of these harmonic manipulations of the row is to divide the row into 3 or 4 chord units. A good instance of this principle is the long piano cadenza in the third movement of the concerto. On a more imaginative level, Schoenberg produces various sequences of chords which are not necessarily derivable from the original row structure by using what could be called a leapfrogging approach to the row. In this manner, he uses the first, third, and fifth tones, the second, fourth, and sixth, either as adjacent notes of a theme or vertically as units of harmonic progression. An example of this is the beautiful opening tutti of the third movement. In it, this theme, and its accompaniment is derived entirely from this principle. At the end of this third movement, Schoenberg brings both of these devices together, both the devices of the chord progressions of the piano cadenza and the leapfrogging technique of the orchestral tutti, and brings them together in what is one of the grandest structures of the mature Schoenberg. In the final movement, Schoenberg really pulls out all the stops. The movement is a rondo, a very pure, classically proportioned rondo, of which the main theme is an inversion somewhat altered rhythmically of the theme of the first movement. It proceeds through the various adventures which a rondo's repetitions can offer, and it's made to seem rather glib and skittish by comparison with the wonderful center section of this rondo, which is a set of 3 variations upon the theme of the slow movement. At the very end of the concerto, Schoenberg brings back the theme which opened it, but here the docile quality of its triple measure is focused into a hearty common time. now, here are the last two movements of the Concerto for Piano and Orchestra, written by Schoenberg in 1942.
composition from vk3sl.
Those were the last two movements of Schoenberg's Concerto for Piano and Orchestra. Well, finally, what about this man, Schoenberg? What sort of influence has he wielded upon our world? I think we must admit that a fundamental change has come over the world of music, and that a good deal of that change has been the responsibility of Schoenberg's work and ideas. It's perfectly true that at the present moment there are such fantastic varieties of musical idioms simultaneously in use, each with their own persuaded initiate, that no one person can be credited or criticized for everything that's happening today. But if it is true that, as Roger Sessions, I think it was, once remarked, all of us, no matter in what way we compose differently because of Schoenberg, what then has really been the effect of this new world of sound introduced by Schoenberg? I think there can be no doubt that one of its basic social effects has been to separate composer and audience. One doesn't like to admit this, but it's true nonetheless. There are, in fact, many people who believe that Schoenberg has been responsible for shattering irreparably the compact between audience and composer, of separating their common bond of reference and creating between them a profound antagonism.
I don't think that the language has become a valid one for the simple reason that it doesn't it has no system of emotional references that is broadly accepted by people who listen to music. I've heard enormous amounts of serial 12-tone tonal music of one sort or another, and it doesn't seem to me to mean much either to me or to the audiences of which I form a part.
Certainly, concert music of today, that part of it at any rate which owes a great deal to the Schoenbergian influence, plays a very small part in the life of most people. It cannot by any means claim to excite the curiosity that was generally aroused by significant new works of 50 or 60 years ago. One must remember that at the turn of the century, any new work by a Richard Strauss or a Gustav Mahler or Rimsky-Korsakov even, or Debussy, was a major event, not only for the cognoscenti, but for a very large lay audience as well. They would go to hear the first performance of a Rosenkavalier or La Mer or Scheherazade with the same sense of excitement that we go nowadays to see the latest Marilyn Monroe picture. This isn't to say that they approved of everything they heard. Certainly they weren't at all prepared for a work like Strauss' Electra, which was found 50 years ago to be gory and hideous and strident and vulgar. But by and large, the current musical production in those days was perhaps the most interesting part of the repertoire to its audience, and the concert programs and operatic events of 50 or 60 years ago were heavily laden with music of that generation. Of course, there's an extenuating circumstance here. It's perfectly true that the focus of music was very much narrower then than it is today. It extended back in the ordinary course of concert going to only about the time of Beethoven, with the occasional work of Mozart or Haydn thrown in, and for the true antiquarian, the very occasional introduction of one of the more familiar works of Johann Sebastian Bach. By contrast, today we'd suffer from malnutrition on a diet like that extends only over 100 years or so. Today, even certain concert pianists, traditionally the most conservative and unimaginative of all musicians, will even consider playing a program that ranges over 300 years of music and ranges moreover into the literature of earlier keyboard instruments. But is this simply compensation? Have we simply transferred our interest to other periods of music because the music of our own time has failed to command our affection and attention? No matter how disinterested the general public may be in the more significant developments of music in their time, I think that there's no doubt that there are some areas in which the vocabulary of atonality, using that term now in a collective sense, has made a quite unobjectionable contribution to contemporary life. It's done this particularly in media in which music furnishes but a part, operas to a degree, if you can consider styling Berg's Wozzeck a hit, but most particularly in that curious specialty of the 20th century known as background music for cinema or television. If you really stop to listen to the music accompanying most of the grade B horror movies that are coming out of Hollywood these days, or perhaps a TV show on space travel,
vk3sl.
you'll be absolutely amazed at the amount of integration which the various idioms of atonality have undergone in these media. That was a fragment of Leonard Rosenman's score for the movie Cobweb, and I must remember to catch that picture. When music like that creeps up on us subliminally, as it were, we seem to accept the devices of a dissonant vocabulary as being perfectly comprehensible. But it's rather frightening to realize that the integration of dissonance from which all of this new music of our day has emanated has assumed a character in the minds of many people which is satisfactory only for displaying the fundamental beastliness of the human animal, and which tends to be dismissed when it attempts to lead a life of its own, a life which is capable of as wide a variety of emotional impact as that of any other musical style.
New characters had emerged, new moods and more rapid changes of expression had been created, and new types of beginning, continuing, contrasting, repeating, and ending had come into usage. 40 years have since proved that the psychological basis of all these changes was correct. Music, without a constant reference to a tonic, was comprehensible, could produce characters and moods, could provoke emotions, and was not bare of being gay or humorous.
In the decade since Schoenberg's death, the work of those who nominally bear his mantle, or who at any rate would seem to be the most conspicuous practitioners of the principles which we owe to him, has developed a spatial concept of sound so lacking in the gravitational impulse of tonality that it makes the quasi-romantic structures of Schoenberg seem like the genial album photos of a dearly loved grandfather. Indeed, many of the more loquacious members of the younger generation have denounced the later work of Schoenberg as having been too shaded with 19th century thought and style.
I know it from experience from one composer which I unfortunately don't want to name who said, but every musician knows, he said, Schoenberg is dead and his music too, as you know. And people came to me, Hartmann in Munich, came to me, and he was very excited about that and told me that will be terrible. Can you imagine what the damage that will do to Schoenberg? And I answered him, it won't do any damage to Schoenberg, it will help Boulez, because if you say something which is out of the ordinary, people will talk about it and so on. And people couldn't understand that I was not at all worried about that. And 2 or 3 years later, I met him in Hamburg, where he conducted already his piece, and he conducts now Schoenberg. So this, I think, is just some kind of a little going away and coming back.
Other composers have extended the techniques of serialism and applied them to composition by electronic means. One of these is the Canadian composer Istvan Anhalt.
Soon after having been engaged in electronic music composition, I became interested in certain compositional problems inherent in this medium, which had little to do with purely serial matters, although I did at times employ serial techniques in various electronic works, especially on the level of the basic material, that is, tunings and temperaments. In contrast to this approach, I would like to mention here Stockhausen's 2 electronic studies and works by Koenig, which are totally serially constructed works, pieces which can be regarded as quasi-ultimate realizations of the principle of total serial organization.
Composers are, on the whole, an incredibly persuasive lot, and one can be reasonably confident that good relations between audience and composer will, in the end, be restored. It may even be that these various forms of integration in which the references of atonalism have so far achieved some success, the horror movie, the science fiction space travel bit, may provide to a degree the necessary common bond. Not that we wish to perpetuate horror movies, and not that space travel may have much to do with serialism, but I suspect that the cliché nature of these devices is the public character of this atonal vocabulary, and that it will become, for our own strange, twisted times, something of the same sort of public reference that the Lutheran chorale provided in the church services of North Europe in the late 16th century. There's no question that the Lutheran chorale acquainted many hostile parishioners with the strange new organization which was to become known as tonality, and I have a suspicion that the adventures of Captain Stratosphere and all other such lunacies that hold us, and particularly our young captive these days, will have some significant part in making a rapprochement between a basically hostile public and the music of their time. And so if this happens and the estrangement is ended, then Schoenberg cannot be regarded as a perpetrator of deviltry. He will come to be regarded as one of the crucial pivot composers in musical history. And the only thing that will remain for us to decide about Schoenberg will be the worth of the man's music itself, not the justification of his historical position. And it's very difficult to find any two people who would exactly agree on what the future will hold for Arnold Schoenberg.
The image of Schoenberg in the year 2000 will to a great extent depend on the development of music, which will take place between today and the year 2000. It seems to me, however, a good guess to say that several of his works will stand up to the test of time, and through them he will continue to represent an important stratum of an important musical period for a long time to come. Or perhaps I should say that his musical voice will be recognized even in the year 2000 as a manifestation of a singularly turbulent period of human history in Central Europe.
I don't think the year 2000 will hold very much for Schoenberg. I don't think that Schoenberg's popularity has increased to any extent even over the past 30 years. There are people who like it, there are people who play it, but the general public has never taken much interest in it, and for the reason I think that it doesn't convey anything much to them. In fact, I would guess that the Schoenberg style is finished, that it offers no future potentialities of any real value.
I find it difficult to imagine exactly what the fate of the pieces will be. It's difficult to know how sympathetic people will be to that curious atmosphere that we connect with Vienna of a certain period and a certain school. That music is inconceivable without the life that those men lived in those days. The sense of terror, the sense of being lonely, the sense of being completely different from the classical tradition around themselves, and yet feeling so strongly that they belonged in it and were the natural result of it. All that makes for, from my standpoint, a rather tortured musical expression. And while it's a very powerful kind of tortured expression, it nevertheless seems rather tortured. Now, whether the big public will find it less and less tortured, which would seem normal, because that's what always has happened in the past, I don't know. Certainly when I listen to Wozzeck now, and I think of Wozzeck 35 years ago when I first heard Stokowski do it, it seems like a different piece. It seems much more continuous, much more accessible to everyone, and it's very possible that the same may happen to Schoenberg's pieces, but not to everything. I doubt whether the Woodwind Quintet will ever seem like a jolly little piece that one would want to put on before breakfast every day.
I hope that he will be recognized as a whole, but even now you can see that Beethoven is not played, every work of his is not played, and in fact people dare, little critics dare to write in the paper, this is a weak work of Beethoven, which every time gives me a cold shower that somebody approaches Beethoven, think this is not one of his important work or one of his weaker work. It is not easy to follow Schoenberg.
When Schoenberg thought about this strange separation of his work from his ideas, which exists in the minds of many people, and when he pondered his role in the future of music, he was fond of telling a story which reminded him of Vienna of his youth and the Emperor Franz Joseph.
This reminds me of an event which occurred about 50 years ago in Vienna. Our Emperor Francis Joseph I usually honored openings of important industrial or artistic expositions by his presence. On such occasions, the chairman of the committees were allowed to present prominent industrialists and artists to the emperor. In this special case, the German did it as it was customary with ordinary citizens. Your Majesty, may I present Mr. So-and-so, a great industrialist. Thereafter, turning to the gentleman, he added, His Majesty, the Emperor. After he had done that several times, the Emperor said softly, by now I hope the gentleman will know who I am. May I hope in another 50 years they will also know who I am.
We are too close to Schoenberg to really evaluate him. Anything that we may say about him now is either the result of guesswork or of blind faith, or of reading into his views on historical evolution and importance which we transfer to his music. But if you want my guess, and if you will accept it as from one who has made a strong effort to separate the theorist from the composer, who's endeavored not to confuse the less than perfect logic which sometimes governs Schoenberg's theories with the value judgment of his work, it is then that I would guess, and you can confuse it with blind faith if you will, that we will someday know indeed who he was. We will someday know that he was one of the greatest composers who ever lived.
This is a test transmission from vk3sl.
Arnold Schoenberg, the man who changed music. This 2-hour radio portrait of Arnold Schoenberg was written and presented by Glenn Gould. Grateful acknowledgement is made to the following whose voices were heard on the program. Mrs. Schoenberg, who was interviewed at her home in California by Glenn Gould, and who very kindly placed at our disposal a tape recording of a lecture titled My Evolution, delivered by Schoenberg a few years before his death. Winthrop Sargent, music critic of the New Yorker magazine. Goddard Liebertson, president of Columbia Records. Aaron Copland, American composer. Dr. Peter Ostwald, San Francisco psychiatrist. And Istvan Anhalt, composer and professor of composition at McGill University in Montreal. The musical illustrations included in the program came from the following works: Verklärte Nacht, Opus 4, Chamber Symphony No. 1, Opus 9, the Second String Quartet in F-sharp minor, Opus 11 piano pieces, Songs of the Hanging Gardens, Opus 15, 6 piano pieces, Opus 19, Serenade, Opus 24, Kol Nidre for speaker, chorus, and orchestra, and the Piano Concerto, Opus 42. The program organizer was John Roberts. This CBC Wednesday night presentation came to you from Toronto and was produced by Carl Little, with technical operations by John Skillen and Tom Prentice. John Ray speaking.
Listening to Schoenberg Demystified, radio documentary made by Glenn Gould in 1962. Amazing how many music luminaries and literary figures were still alive, including Schoenberg's wife in 1962. It's quite a fascinating document, actually. And I might come back to it and listen to sections because there's a few themes to dwell on, I think. Anyhow, thank you for your indulgence. If you've hung around this long, we'll have another music missions of sorts, modulated sound missions, if you're listening on air. And we'll continue tomorrow. Won't have our usual theme exit music. I think we'll finish with Mr. A.S. Cheers.